quando muito moço, muito jovem, eu fui aos mangues do Recife, aos córregos do Recife, aos morros do Recife, às zonas rurais de Pernambuco, trabalhar com os camponeses, com as camponesas, com os favelados. Eu confesso, sem nenhuma churumingas, eu confesso que fui até lá movido por uma certa lealdade ao Cristo de quem eu era mais ou menos camarada. Mas o que acontece é que quando eu chego lá, a realidade dura do favelado, a realidade dura do camponês, a negação do seu ser como gente, a tendência àquela adaptação de que a gente falou antes, aquele estado quase inerte diante da negação da liberdade. Aquilo tudo me remeteu a Marx. Eu sempre digo, não foram os camponeses que disseram a mim: Paulo, tu já leste Marx? Não, de jeito nenhum, eles não liam nem jornal. Foi a realidade deles que me remeteu a Marx. E eu fui a Marx. E aí é que os jornalistas europeus, em 70, não entenderam a minha afirmação. É que quanto mais eu li Marx, tanto mais eu encontrei uma certa fundamentação objetiva para continuar camarada de Cristo. Então, as leituras que eu fiz de Marx, de alongamentos de Marx, não me sugeriram jamais que eu deixasse de encontrar Cristo na esquina das próprias favelas. Eu fiquei com Marx na mundanidade à procura de Cristo na transcendência.
Power is not always about domination. It's not exclusively about domination. It's also about resistance. And young people have a lot of power. They can shut societies down. They can shut them down. They can block streets. They can engage in direct action. They can educate their parents. They're a potent political force, and I think that what they need to do is to recognize themselves as a potent political force, and I think they need to act. Education is not just about empowering people. It's not just about the practice of freedom. It's also in some ways about killing the imagination, and in some ways educating people to adjust to conditions in which their own sense of agency is basically limited. For instance, we often see pedagogies that teach to the test. We often see pedagogies that are simply about accountability, objective standards, pedagogies that in no way take into consideration the experience of students, in no way speak to important social issues. They're pedagogies that in many ways are designed to undercut the possibility for students to be critical thinkers, to be critically conscious, to be aware of their own cultural capital and its strengths and their place in the world. And I think that it's rightly so to call those pedagogies of repression. The debate about education today, and with its emphasis on methods, represents a new kind of pedagogical stupidity, because it completely ignores the most fundamental question of education, and that is, what is education for? And it ignores the most fundamental struggle inherent in education, which is a struggle over identities, a struggle over agency. Education, in the final analysis, is really about the production of agency. You know, what kind of agents are we going to produce? What kind of narratives are we going to produce that students can understand, that enlarge their perspective on not only on the world, but on their relationship to others and themselves? And I think that methods, to begin with methods, is to completely ignore probably all the most fundamental questions about education: ideology, culture, power, authority. How are these things constituted? What's the basis for knowledge? Who has the authority to implement it? In what way does it speak to a particular kind of future? Because all education is an introduction in some way to the future. It's a struggle over what kind of future you want for young people. It's a struggle over the kinds of subjectivities that would make that future possible. It's a struggle over notions of narrative that students can relate to and in some way understand, so they can see education as being fundamental to who they are and how they relate to the world. Methods doesn't do that. Methods contain a kind of silence on the side of the worst forms of repression, it seems to me, because they deny the very notion that students are alive. Can be alive to both themselves, to particular forms of knowledge, particular forms of social experiences, and particular values. The notion of neutrality, and when it's raised in education, is the worst form of politics. In itself, it's a political issue. It's a political question, because it's taken a value around education in ways to hide what education is really about. I've always viewed that position as the basis for a kind of fascist politics, because it hides its code for not allowing people to understand the role that education plays ideologically, the role that it plays in producing particular forms of knowledge, particular forms of power, particular kinds of social values, particular notions of agency, particular narratives about the world. It's impossible for education to be neutral. There's no such thing as a neutral education. So those who argue that education should be neutral are really arguing for a version of education that's not, in which nobody's accountable. That the people who produce that form of education disappear. They become invisible because they're saying it's neutral. And so you can't identify the ideological processes, politics, modes of power at work. And that's precisely what they want. I mean, look, power at its worst is invisible. It makes itself invisible. And I think that the notion that education is neutral is to me one way of people who have dominant power making it invisible and making propaganda itself incapable of being seen. It seems to me that at the heart of critical pedagogy is that it's not just about, it's not a skill. We're not talking about skills, you know, we're talking about critical consciousness. You know, conscientization, right? I mean, we're talking about what does it mean to create the tools where people can be not only critics, but can be cultural producers. And I think that what the new technology offers for young people, particularly for young people, is the opportunity to operate outside of traditional spheres of the media, particularly the mainstream media, in ways that they've never had that opportunity before. At the same time, we also see the way in which the new media, the new technologies have become enormously weaponized in the interest of repressing people. Google, Facebook. I mean, these are really increasingly technologies of surveillance. That's basically what they are. But that doesn't mean that there aren't enormous possibilities for these technologies to be used, and we've seen them used in relatively progressive and radical ways. I mean, my theory about those technologies is that we have to judge them within the societies that are using them according to very specific values. So it's not that the technology alone, you know, produces very specific relationships. They operate according to the values that basically align with certain modes of power to put into play how those things would be used. Selfies, you know, selfies are the mirror of neoliberalism, right? I mean, but selfies don't have to be. Disabled people can project modes of representation that dignify who they are. It's a struggle. All of these technologies are part of a larger struggle over cultural politics. In the beginning, when these technologies emerged, there was a kind of romanticization about these technologies, saying that this is the new democracy, right? Because they divorced those technologies from questions of power and the concentration of power, and how the concentration of power can basically absorb almost anything in a capitalist society, particularly a neoliberal society. And I think that has to be challenged. I mean, I think that what we're seeing now, I think you have to be pretty stupid to believe that Google is, you know, somehow on the side of democracy, right? You have to be pretty stupid to believe that Microsoft really cares about social justice. You know, you have to be pretty stupid to believe that in some way Twitter, you know, is a new form of literacy. Look, capitalism and democracy are not the same thing. Let's begin there. Let's say that you can't talk about democracy if you're talking about capitalism, because capitalism is the antithesis of democracy, because capitalism doesn't believe in shared justice and shared power and shared responsibilities. It believes in accumulated profits. That's very different, right? And so it seems to me that a debate over democracy, particularly in terms of linking three things: political rights, personal liberties, and economic rights. There is no democracy that does not talk about economic rights. It doesn't exist. I mean, you can have a range of personal freedoms and political individual freedoms, and I'm delighted with freedom of the press. And I'm delighted with the ability to go to choose any religion I want. But I'm not delighted with the notion that anybody can either sleep at the Ritz or sleep under a bridge. Sorry, doesn't work that way. I don't think any democracy is really worthy of the name, because I don't think any democracy is finally finished or completed. I think that what democracy is, and what I like about it, is the fact that it represents an ideal in which no society is ever just enough. The concept at its best means it's unfinished. It's never fully completed. You always have to work at it. It's always a site of struggle. Gramsci says, he uses a term called the Interregnum. He says, it's a period when the old order is dying and new societies are emerging. And in the middle is that moment of restlessness, that moment of uncertainty. That moment today is increasingly dominated by a fascist politics. It's dominated by right-wing groups, hate groups. It's dominated by people who hate immigrants, who hate refugees. It's dominated by neo-Nazis. It's dominated by white nationalists. And we need to be aware of that. I mean, we need to be aware that the language of democracy has been undermined by neoliberalism, by the hedge fund operators, by the capitalists, and we haven't been able to recover. And so now we talk about illiberal democracy. We say in Hungary, in Poland, we say things like, we need a democracy means that you have security, but you don't have freedom. You have to give up freedom for security. Can you imagine? That's the degree to which democracy has failed. Because you can't have a democracy without informed citizens. And that's why education has to be at the center of any discourse about democracy. And it isn't. And I think that's where the left has failed. The left has failed around education. They have failed because they believe that the most important structures of domination are entirely economic, and not only those elements that trade in beliefs and persuasion and pedagogy and changing consciousness and modes of identification. Uncertainties can be a time of great anxiety, and they can be a time of great possibility, a time to rethink the language of politics, to rethink the language of struggle, rethink the language of solidarity. Power is not always about domination. It's not exclusively about domination. It's also about resistance. And young people have a lot of power. They can shut societies down. They can shut them down. They can block streets. They can engage in direct action. They can educate their parents. They're a potent political force. And I think that what they need to do is to recognize themselves as a potent political force. And I think they need to act. Because I think that a discourse of anxiety should give way to a discourse of critique. And a discourse of critique should give way to a discourse of possibility. And a discourse of possibility means that you can imagine a future very different from the present. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm grateful that you're here. I'm particularly delighted about this award because, I worked with Paulo Freire for about 15 years. And during that time, we did the almost impossible. We started a series in education and cultural studies through which we got about 100 people tenure. And the purpose of the series was not only to produce good work, the purpose of the series was to produce work that couldn't get published basically in the mainstream press. And so what we did was we brought together a number of scholars who published that work and had the requisites to get onto tenure tracks, because they did exist once. And we saw that as an important kind of political intervention, sort of bringing people together in ways that suggested a kind of solidarity that went beyond simply getting them jobs, putting them in positions where they could actually make a difference in the world in which they found themselves.
When will we be bold enough to look internally and to say, you no longer have a place here if that's the mentality? You no longer have a job here if you can't get on board. We are closing the gate. We will meet them at the gate and we will discuss it. And when they feel better about what's going on inside this gate, they can come in the spirit of positivity. They can question us, they can challenge us, but they cannot dismantle us. We are locking the gate and checking for entry. That's the challenge that we'll take into next year, is to stop focusing on the parents and their pushback and start focusing on how did these parents get in, because these are the people we let into the gate. And they're behaving that way because we gave them the impression up until this point that it was okay to behave that way. How do we change? January 6th, lives every day in our independent schools. And New York schools, y'all are living it the most and the most out loud. And the whole nation of independent schools are watching and reacting from your narrative. And so I'm asking you to meet your resistance with resilience. I'm asking you to stay strong and stay true. I'm asking you to lock the gate and check for entry. I'm asking you to put on your pants and go back in there, even if you have to do it with the troops like we did in 1954, or like I did in 2002, or like in my mind, I still do every day that I come into the school, because it matters. Know that the work you're doing, New York, you're carrying for all of us. Because if